All right, well, welcome this morning. We're going to go and get started. Roger, I don't know if you could close those doors for me. It's kind of a lot of glare coming through here this morning. Happens in the fall and winter. We want people to come in as they trickle in, but I am blinded by the glory of the Sun City coming through the doors. So, but we're going to be here in Deuteronomy, and I think that we got most of the way through chapter 11, and I feel a little bit at risk. I made a little joke years ago about a gentleman, and he was a very godly man, very studious student of the Word, who was trying to take some fairly disaffected young adults at the time and cause them to be able to remember things. And he was teaching through Ephesians. And he said, this is the outline. This is the outline you need to remember for Ephesians. So he's trying to communicate an outline for all of Ephesians that you could remember what God has done for us in the first half, what we do for God in the second half. The sum total of his outline. And I feel like I'm telling you things like that, kind of, right? I kind of went, well, I mean, it's true, right? But that's like the whole Bible. The whole Bible is essentially what God has done for us and what we do for God. I mean, how to serve as the church and all that. We understand foundational and then application. And so in Deuteronomy, I almost sense that Moses must have felt like that, actually, because he repeats a lot of themes in Deuteronomy. Because remember, this is his last hurrah, so to speak, a swan song, if you want to call it that. The Lord has told him, and indeed by the end of Deuteronomy, he dies physically, so he passes away. And so somebody added that, later on into Deuteronomy. It would be quite a trick for you to write down the chapter recording your own death, right? Yes? Yes, it would be. And so he repeats themes quite a lot. And chapter 11 is no different. He does that, and one of the things that we have to understand about the Old Testament and really certain portions of the New Testament, such as Hebrews, is the nature of the way that they remember things. The logical progression is not linear. Exactly. You kind of envision concentric circles around a point, right? So they will come around and around and around, and every time they come around, they do not pass go, don't get $200, they make an application. And then they review the material and do it again and make another application. And that's kind of what we see here in Deuteronomy, I think. We're seeing the nature of that logic. And so if you try to remember it linearly, you're going to have a problem. We need to note the applications as they go. And so in chapter 11, it's no different. It's no surprise. He's talking about the nature of this new generation's obligations in the land. And they're not there yet, right? They haven't entered yet. They have not possessed yet. They have not dispossessed the Canaanites who have been there for centuries, are well established, great nations, super tall, super big, lots of armaments, lots of armies, lots of people, and walled cities everywhere. And he tells them, look, the key to your success is not your might, it is not your strategy, it is not your wisdom, it is not your work ethic, it is not any of those things. It is simply obeying. It's simply obeying what I tell you to do. And if you do it the way that I tell you to do it, you follow these statutes and these commandments that I'm giving you today, to you, not your fathers, to you, not your children. That's one of those non-linear logic things, right? He said those in two different places. I'm giving you this command, not to your fathers that I give you this command, but to you today. And I'm not giving it to your sons yet. That's not your obligation yet. It's your obligation today to do this. And that is to follow these statutes and commands so that you will live a long time in the land. You will have a long life. You will see lots of children and grandchildren. You will have lots of food at your feasts, and you will be able to mark all of them in the land. And you will be in good shape. You'll be taken care of if you do that. And so we got down here roughly to verse 16, I think, maybe a little bit further. He repeats that the concept, right? I think we got through this, and that is that when you are comfortable, right, when you're kind of fat and sassy in the land, and you're feeling good, don't be deceived. And don't dare fail to communicate to your children what the key was to your abundance and your comfort. And the key is God's grace. The key is God's promises. The key is doing what He says to do and not strategizing other things. Now, I have occasionally made a statement how remarkable it is that when God set up a nation, He did so with a judicial code of only a few hundred commandments. We commonly cite the 613 number. I'm not sure that's accurate. I think it's almost half that, maybe even a little less. And I've had somebody disagree with me recently who knows what he's talking about. At least he is a Hebrew and Old Testament scholar, and he would say that it was not intended to be all the laws of the land, simply because it just couldn't be enough. I mean, that's kind of the idea. Well, yes, it can be enough. In fact, Jesus summed up the whole law, right, into one and two commandments. The greatest and the second greatest, you shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And if I have to expand that principle beyond a few hundred commandments, I am inserting my own scruples and own strategy and own wisdom in it. So I will hold by that statement that when God created a nation, He did so on just a few hundred commandments. And virtually every time that they added to it, added a tax, added a plan or a strategy, it failed and caused them trouble. So He says, write these on your doorposts, remind the generations of what brought you here and what's keeping you here. And you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. And really remarkably, He states it in those terms: everywhere you place the sole of your foot shall be yours. And you shall have these borders. God created borders, by the way. There will be borders in the millennial kingdom. It seems to me that there will be borders in eternity, despite the foolishness that says otherwise, that it'll just be one big happy mishmash of humanity. It seems to me that in eternity, there are distinctions to be made, and those are holy, right, and good. And we see that even in the study of eschatology and the study of Scripture into the future. So don't let people tell you that God didn't design borders. He did. He tells even His own chosen people, you're not going to have the whole world, you're going to have these borders. To Lebanon, to the river Euphrates, and to the western sea. And within those borders, no man will stand before you. Verse 25, no man will be able to stand before you. Yahweh your God will lay the dread of you and the fear of you on all the land on which you set foot, as He has spoken to you. Now that's what God told humanity after the flood about creation, by the way. That there was a distinction set between humanity and the rest of the created order. There will be dread, right? You ever wonder why animals run away when you're just walking along? I mean, you don't even have to point a bow and arrow at them or a gun. They're afraid of you, generally speaking, and you have to work hard in order to make that otherwise. And He's saying it's going to be like that. People that are bigger than you, stronger than you, smarter than you, better than you, more trained than you are going to be in dread of you. Verse 26 is, I think, where we got to, so let's read that explicitly. So my son Isaac believes that we do not read enough verses in Sunday school because he actually asked me today to simply read the verses. I don't think that he realized that then that gives me 45 minutes to read the verses. So I think he thought it was going to be shorter somehow. I encouraged him that it was going to feel much, much longer if I just did that. So you're welcome. I'm not following the 12-year-old boy's directives in Sunday school this morning, but we are going to read these verses because I think there's an important designation here. Moses says to the people, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse." Remember, this is a conditional covenant. You do what I say to do, and you will be fat and sassy in the land. If you don't do what I say to do, you will not be in the land, and you will not be fat and sassy. You'll be in slavery and suffering. That's what will happen. I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you listen to the commandments of Yahweh your God, which I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not listen to the commandments of Yahweh your God, but turned aside from the way which I am commanding you today by following other gods which you have not known. In other words, there's only one God that's revealed himself to you. If you go out and worship other ones, you're borrowing those, right? You're borrowing their problems, you're borrowing their personalities, it's a mess. There's only one God that has revealed himself to you. But if you do go off the reservation, if you go off and worship those other gods that haven't even bothered to acknowledge your existence, much less given you their name, right? Because that's who Israel is. Israel is the one nation on the face of the planet that had received the very name of God. So if you deny that and you go off and worship the fishes of the sea, or you go off and worship the gods of the Phoenicians or the Philistines or all the 16,000 Baals out in Canaan or whatever, that you're going to suffer. That's what's going to happen. Because that's a God of suffering. You're just going to be like the other nations. And it shall come about, verse 29, when Yahweh your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not across the Jordan? This is important. Are they not across the Jordan, west of the way toward the sunset, on the west there, right, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, besides the oaks of Moreh? Okay, so y'all got that figured out? You know where Moreh is and where those oak trees are? You've probably lived in a place where they give you directions like that. You know, they tell you to turn left by a house that hasn't been there in 100 years or something, and you're like, well, don't worry about the landmarks. That's not the important part. But notice where the mounts are. Mount Gerizim, right? And Mount Ebal. Both of them are in the land that they're going to possess. Now this comes up 2 or 3 more times in Deuteronomy, the distinction. They're not to place the cursing on a mountain outside of the land, because the curse does not have to do with what they do outside of the land. Both the blessing and the curse are in Canaan, because that's where the law is applied. That's where the blessings are promised. And that's where the curses come into effect if they don't do what God says to do in the land. And this is important, right? Because like when we went through Daniel, I remember asking at the beginning of Daniel, remember, because Daniel and the young men come into Nebuchadnezzar's house, and they only want to eat vegetables. All of a sudden they become vegans. You know, have you ever put steak sauce on a piece of celery? It somehow doesn't get better. It somehow gets worse. And so everybody looks at Daniel and the young men, and they become vegans, and we go, wow, they're trying to keep the law in Babylon. No, they weren't. They weren't. Because you can't keep the law in Babylon. In fact, Moses makes that clear in the next chapter. You can't keep the law in Babylon. They were trying not to get sick. They were trying not to die, in my opinion. They weren't, it was a blessing that God placed upon them. Right? But you can't keep the law outside of the land. And this picture is clear about that. The blessing and the curse are on mountains in the land. And actually, I think this is what the Samaritans eventually came to observe, that because there were these stones at Mount Gerizim, remember the Samaritans don't exist yet, for one thing. They were hybridized folks that came up while the Israelites were exiled out of the land. And they worshipped on Mount Gerizim. They had a temple. And remember, Jesus has this conversation with the woman at the well. And she says, well, we say that we're supposed to worship on Mount Gerizim. Well, why would they get that idea? Well, it's because that's where God had them put commemorative stones to remember the nature of the blessing in the land. Was on Mount Gerizim. Nobody built the temple on Mount Ebal. I don't know why. Because that was the mountain with the curses written on them. The stones of commemoration of the curse. But both of them were in the land, and neither of them were where you're supposed to build a temple. But we'll get there. So, for you, he says, verse 31, are about to cross the Jordan to go in to possess the land which Yahweh your God is giving you. And you shall possess it and live in it, and you shall be careful to do all the statutes and the judgments which I am setting before you today. So you're going to own mountains. You're not going to be nomadic. You're going to be able to put a commemorative stone there, and it's going to serve a purpose for all your generations. I don't know if you understand how important that is to a person that has been moving around. Military families, I think, feel this. I grew up being afraid to pour concrete. Because what if I don't want the concrete there? Then I got to move the concrete. What if I got to do? I didn't want to pour a sidewalk. I didn't want to do this. I didn't. So you hear some people, I don't want to plant a tree. I'm not going to get to enjoy that tree. By the way, there's a proverb about that, right? That the nation grows great when men plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. But there are lifestyles that make it hard, right? The only thing that Priscilla and I could have done until the last few years that would have moved us around more probably would have been the military. We moved around a lot, and we're in very strange situations due to that. In fact, to be honest, and this is not a statement about Priscilla, it's a statement about how exceptional Priscilla is. There were so many days that I came home not expecting her to be there because I had put her in such a weird situation, living accommodations-wise. I mean, I was like, oh my goodness, she's here. That's great. Okay, let's keep going. And that's what you can do. I mean, and that is her exceptionality, because 99.9% of women wouldn't still be sitting here, honestly. Because we were not able to do that. And so what he is promising to these folks, they have never known a home. They've never known a nation. They've never had a farm. They've not ever planted crops. They have never harvested grapes from their own vineyards. They have never harvested their own grain. What have they been eating as they've been walking through the desert? Some unidentifiable substance that somehow tastes like honey and wafers and looks like coriander. Now I want you to go home. You probably have some coriander. So you know what coriander is? It's when you mess up growing your cilantro, right? Cilantro bolts like that. If you've ever tried to grow cilantro, it is almost impossible not to get coriander. And I want you to go home. If you don't have any, you can look up what it looks like. Pour a bunch of coriander in your hands and ask yourself, do I want to eat that? You don't. So I'm thinking, it doesn't even look that great. It tastes good. He's promising to them, you can put these commemorative stones on these mountains because they are yours. And these are memories that are relevant to you, the blessing and the curse for generations and generations and generations to come. And it's a privilege even to be able to put those stones there, right? Because they've been packing their tent through the desert since they could walk. It's becoming fashionable today, right? You can cruise across the internet and find people who think it's the best thing ever to live in a van down by the river. You remember the skit. Tammy remembers the skit. You bunch of sinners. It's an old is it Chris Farley? Yeah, Chris Farley skit on Saturday Night. He's a motivational speaker. Don't take this as an endorsement. But repetitively in the skit, these parents bring in the motivational speaker, and his application is, or you will end up living in a van down by the river. Right? That was largely considered not a positive thing when I was growing up. It was not something you posted about on Instagram. Check out how cool my van is. That was one stage of homelessness, but that's how these people were living out in the desert. This is tremendous, a tremendous blessing that they were being promised, to be able to even just set commemorative stones on mountains. Even the curses, that God cared enough to tell them which way to walk and which way not to walk, rather than simply allowing them to screw up and start sacrificing until they got enough. Because that's what the pagan gods do. Right? We've been over that in Mesoamerica as well as the ancient Near East. If they had a drought, they would just start sacrificing things until the blood flowed chest high, and eventually it rained. Because their gods did not reveal themselves to them and did not tell them which way to go. But God did. He placed the commemoration between two mountains and said, walk this way. Walk this way. All right, so chapter 12. Any questions about chapter 11? Again, I said there's a lot of repetition. Anybody? No questions. Good. I guess I'm that good, huh? Covered it all. Two options. You can either be confusing everybody and they have no idea what to ask, or you can be so clear that nobody needs to ask anything. See, and people think I'm not an optimist, you know? I'm an optimist. All right, verse 1, chapter 12. Another section, he bookends them. These are the statutes. Be careful to do the statutes. So we have another section. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully keep or observe in the land which Yahweh your God of your fathers has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. By the way, how long is Israel as a people guaranteed to live on the earth? Any other nation have this kind of promise? Israel is the only one guaranteed to persist as a people, as a nation. Land, seed, blessing forever. We forgot that part in junior high. Didn't get that added till later. Land, seed, blessing is the Abrahamic covenant. The forever part becomes more clear under the Davidic covenant that comes later, that there will always be a line of David to rule over the people. It will persist. So as long as you live on the earth, this is the key to possessing your land and your inheritance. So verse 2, key to that, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. In other words, they were doing this everywhere. Because again, their gods were not self-revealing gods. They just presumed that they needed to be doing obeisance to these gods everywhere. And so, under any tree, any hole in the ground, any river, anywhere ever, they didn't know where to go and what to do, so they did it everywhere. Very stressful, right? It's not a good parenting tactic. It's not a good divinity tactic. Your children, in other words, should know what to expect from you generally, right? Yeah? When you ask somebody, would your dad allow you to do this? They should be able to answer pretty quickly, yes or no, right? It shouldn't be new information. This is kind of how I see the difference between these two. It says, you shall tear down their altars and smash their pillars and burn their asherim with fire, and you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. Go through the whole nation, everywhere your sole of your foot takes possession of it, and you shall obliterate the names of those gods and their worship spots out in nature. So you shall not allow those things to persist. Verse 4, that you shall not act like this towards Yahweh your God. In other words, God does not want you to worship him under a big dandelion. God does not want you to worship him under every tree. He does not want you to create a sanctified space out of everything and be worried about what you're doing in that spot. This is important. So, to illustrate, in Texas, there are laws regarding what you do with corpses, right? Bodies. And so you need to be careful if you're one of those people that inherits like a ranch from somebody. You know, everybody in Texas has the romanticized idea they want to be buried with their boots on their own property, whatever. You better be careful to put a chain link fence around the spot where you intend to put bodies, or you just turned your whole ranch into a cemetery that is regulated as a cemetery, right? I'm not asking you, actually, I'm telling you, that is right. That is what happens. So fence off an acre and make that the family plot, because you can see it. Where Jeremiah and I are from, they split 281. Part of the reason they split 281 where they split it, U.S. Highway 281, is because there is an old family plot in the median, and they couldn't put a highway there, so they had to go this way. And we're not talking about Indian burial mounds. I mean, these are good old German settlers, ranchers or whatever. They got buried there. And so they couldn't do that. You don't want to turn everywhere you go into a cemetery. You don't want everywhere to be regulated like that. And that's what I think he's cautioning them. You don't want to turn, the whole land is not a sanctuary. The land is for your blessing and for your abundance, for you to work, to receive the produce of the land. Do not turn it all into a temple like the pagans do, because that's why they're getting driven out. You don't just worship God anywhere you want. This is why I do cringe a little bit when people say that they go to church in their bass boat. You ever heard somebody say something like that? I'm closer to Jesus on the bass boat. I'm like, well, you can pray on your bass boat or whatever, but God has given us, even as a church, guidelines, right, for worshiping. That we're supposed to fellowship together, the old joke, like, if you go bass fishing with a Baptist, you better take 2 of them. Because if you only take 1, they'll drink all your beer. Becky doesn't get it, but maybe I should explain, but then somebody else explain it to Becky later. Okay. There's also a 300-mile Baptist. They won't drink a beer within 300 miles of their church because they might run into somebody that'll tell on them. And not that they don't drink beer, right? Okay. Anyway, you shall not act like this, Israelites. Once you enter the land, you're not going to treat everywhere, right, as a commemoration or as a sanctuary. Verse 5 says, but you shall seek Yahweh your God, I think that's an appropriate insertion there in italics, at the place which Yahweh your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. Now, it may sound like a sacrifice to do that you have to get up and go where God says to go. But the blessing in that is that you don't have to treat your whole farm like it's the tabernacle. You don't have to treat your whole vineyard as if now that was given for their blessing and not for the place of sacrifice. So that's important. So there you shall bring, verse 6, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contributions of your hand, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your household shall eat before Yahweh your God and rejoice in all your undertakings in which Yahweh your God has blessed you. You shall not do at all what we are doing here today. So remember, they're not in the land yet. He says, you shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Even right then. Right? We quote that in Judges, and we say, well, that is a really negative statement. Every idiot out there was doing what every idiot wants every other idiot to do. I mean, they were just doing all idiot stuff. Moses didn't use it that way here. He wasn't saying you're acting like idiots now. But you can't bring your first fruit offerings because you're nomads right now. You're not cultivating anything. You can't bring your grain offerings and all these other offerings that was going to be mandated in the land. You don't have any of that stuff. You're still eating manna. The way I see it anyway here. But he gives a reason. For you have not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which Yahweh your God is giving you. So you have to go in and seize it, right? And this is a principle that comes it is a trans-dispensational principle, right? You are not given any Canaanites to go conquer, right? Yes? No? I don't think so. You're not given Canaanites to conquer. You're not given a land to take. But the principle we can elevate a little higher from that, and that is to say that the testing comes before the resting. Right? So we're promised a rest, are we not, in the future? The way that Dr. Earl Rodmacher would say it, I think, is where he originated this statement and said, this is training time for reigning time. And he may have gotten it from somebody else, but Dr. Rodmacher was probably 90 when he died 10 years ago. So all the input he got, I don't know. So he was the first guy I've ever heard, and everybody I heard say it after that was copying him. So, maybe Abraham Lincoln said it, I don't know. But testing comes before resting. He's saying, you are going to have to go into the land. You are going to have to put the sole of your feet on the land. You are going to have to obey. You're going to have to do what I say to do. And when you're brought into the land, you can rest. And it's at that time that I will ask you to begin to worship according to these standards. Right now, they were operating under some very basic transitory rules, right? This is how you will march. This is how you will camp. This is where the tabernacle will be. But the law as a calendar of celebrations and commemorations had not come into effect yet. Verse 10 says, when you cross the Jordan and live in the land which Yahweh your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies around you so that you live in security, then it shall come about that the place in which Yahweh your God will choose for his name to dwell, then you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution of your land, and all your choice votive offerings which you will vow to Yahweh. Now this is an interesting concept, right? In this theocratic nation established by a God who reveals himself, there is a system, right, of bringing tithes and offerings, and it is proportionate. So if you read the history of the world, you find, for one thing, you find that our taxation rates are insane in the United States. Even the lowest is 10 times, roughly, what it took to cause a revolution over a breakfast beverage. The lowest tax rate we have right now. Historically speaking, it was very common in the civilized nations of the world to have a flat tax. Whether you were poor or rich, you paid this much tax. And they were able to wage wars and on all that money. This is not actually flat, is it? How do they get the stuff to bring to the sacrifices? What do they do to do that? Do they do it by their own wits? Do they pull themselves up by the American dream, the bootstraps? Do they strategize their entrepreneurship? No. What do? They follow the statutes and the commands in the land. And they go where God says to go to worship him, and they worship the way he says to worship them. And as a result of that produce, they're supposed to bring a certain portion of it as an offering or a sacrifice back to God. Here's the unique thing about that. What if they're not that good at keeping the statutes and the commands? Like they're not that great at farmers. Or they're not that... As we pointed out earlier, I think a few lessons ago, remember that the land was apportioned based on the tribe's size, right? The big tribes got more land, the little tribes got less land, and we pointed out, how did you get a good-sized tribe after the Exodus? Anybody remember how we got a good-sized tribe? How you avoided having a small tribe after your Exodus experience? You did. Not being struck dead by Yahweh is a good start, because there were thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of men struck down because they either engaged in temple prostitution or offered strange fire before the Lord, or were swallowed up with the Korah rebellion in Numbers 16. And those are huge family groups. So by the time they get to the apportionment of their inheritance in the land, that has profound and real eternal effects for the inheritance that they receive in the land. But what's interesting is that the smaller tribes that got smaller amounts of land and smaller farms and smaller vineyards, because of their disobedience, were graciously not required to bring the same amount that the big tribes were that had lots of land and lots of vineyards. Right? Isn't that gracious? Because in most fair and just human systems, everybody paid the same number of pennies. It didn't matter how good of a businessman you were. If you were a citizen of the Republic, you paid this amount of money. Yesterday, Hank and I went to represent the Beekeepers Association at a Master Gardener event. I don't know if y'all have heard of the Mustard Seed Garden down here off of Sunset. I'm good friends with the director of that program, and they asked us to come. And I was sitting there with a beekeeper friend of mine, and he said, well, bees are like the IRS, he says. Now that is probably defamation against the poor bees. He said, this is why bees are like the IRS, or beekeepers are like the IRS, something like that. And he said, well, we only take what the bees don't need. I don't think any of us have ever asked the bees how much they would prefer to keep. So anyway, that got my hackles up a little bit. The truth is, and he said, well, the key to the bees' survival through all these millions of years is cooperation. I said, no, it's not. Every bee colony is a nation state, and they try to kill all the other nation states and take their stuff. It's very geopolitically appropriate, actually. I mean, that's how humanity in the fall has always existed. So yes, it is like that. But you've got to observe a little higher of what bee colonies do to each other. Bee colonies do not cooperate with each other. They try to kill each other and take their stuff. Sounds kind of like the army, right? They kill people and break stuff. That's what they do. Under orders, of course. Anyway. So the taxation rate even, which is functionally what a tithe and the offerings were that were mandated, right, is based on the produce that they bring. The timing was established. And so they didn't have to they weren't supposed to starve their families in order to serve God. They weren't supposed to run themselves into poverty. They were supposed to embrace abundance and riches in the land with obedience and do what God said to do, and they were promised more abundance because of their obedience in that. When he does that, and you shall rejoice, verse 12, before Yahweh your God. We got 5 minutes, so be prepared for 36 seconds here. That's the way this goes in the last 5 minutes. You shall rejoice before Yahweh your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic or high place that you see, but in the place which Yahweh chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of Yahweh your God, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. I would just like to explain what's happening there a little bit, because I think it is important to identify when a law has been mutilated. Okay, so you know that you can go in. There are some people who won't buy meat from Walmart. Did you know that? Because almost all of the meat at Walmart is halal stamped. What that means, it's essentially, and kosher has this problem too, and I'll explain that here in a minute, that Islam, and actually I believe modern observant Jewish orthodoxy, views every animal that is slaughtered as a sacrifice. They view every single one of them as a sacrifice, and so when you see that stamp, that means that that animal has been prepared according to their religious structure and been blessed and dedicated to their deity. So some people don't want to eat halal meat because it's been sacrificed to a demonic being, which is their right to do so. But it's not any better, actually, than what the kosher principle is under rabbinic understanding of the law, and it's actually wrong. They view the meat the same way. They pronounce a blessing over the meat, and they stamp it kosher. and everything is viewed as done this way, not just to identify that it is clean, because those standards are very minimal in Scripture. What makes a clean animal clean and how to make it clean, you shouldn't eat the blood in it, et cetera, et cetera. That goes way back. I mean, way back to Noah, that you shouldn't eat the blood in their pre-law. But God says this. Now, you're not supposed to take every animal that you slaughter and treat it as an act of sacrificial worship. And in fact, you don't even have to, you can do it in every city and everybody can eat of the thing. And it's not supposed to be a religious observance, it's just supposed to be lunch. Right? And so we're not supposed to take the principles that God gives and make them this expansive mess like that and turn every single butchered goat and deer and gazelle and whatever else into an act of worship. It's simply supposed to be lunch, and we can thank God for it, but we don't have to dedicate it to Him, and that's not what He designed to do, because it's actually a violation of His law. Because you're not supposed to sacrifice to God anywhere willy-nilly, everywhere you are. You're supposed to do it where He says. You're supposed to go on the calendar to the temple or the tabernacle and sacrifice there. And while you do it, you're supposed to celebrate with all your cousins about how good God is and how good He's been to you since the last time you saw each other. But you're not supposed to treat every time you go shoot a deer as an act of worship. Right? You guys watch Alaska, The Last Frontier? It's all smoke and mirrors, but I like to watch the show. But they do this because they're a bunch of pagans. They are. I mean, they're pagans. I like them. I dig it. You know, I like them a lot as people. But every time they shoot a deer, they're like, thank you, brother deer, blah, 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 or the bear and all that. Like they're some sort of Indians. They're not. What are they, Norwegian or something? I'm an Indian and I don't do that. Anyway, not every time you shoot a deer, you're supposed to pray to it or pray to anybody else. You're supposed to thank the Lord that He provided for you. You know? The Benjamin Martin prayer, Lord, make me fast and accurate. Thanks. You know? Of course, that was about shooting other things. That was about shooting bipeds, but anyway. All right, we're out of minutes. I did want to get to that point because I think it illustrates a lot of what has happened to the law and how inappropriate it is to make it more expansive. It was designed to be limited and narrow so that you could have lots of freedom. So the Israelites got lots of freedom in the land and actually own their land and actually enjoy the abundance of it. Instead of having to, well, anyway. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Josh, as we're wrapping up chapter 11,
Yes.
you made a comment to the effect of, that they could keep the law outside of the promised land.
That's right.
They should try to observe it or live according to it, or is it just that blessings associated with
Yeah, so I think in exile, they default back to somewhat of the non-negative principle which Moses presented, which was everyone needs to do your best. You need to do your best to not violate God's law. I mean, that wasn't a negative, right? When Moses said that, don't do what you're doing here today, which is not living under the law. You don't have blessing and curses under the law because the mountains are over there and you're not over there yet. So, for instance, we read about Esther, right? So, Esther is living in exile. Do you know the story of Esther, Scott? Not well, okay. So, actually, even possibly the story of Ruth. There's some opinions about that. But when Esther gets called up to candidate, I guess, for the wife of the king, they were required to sleep with the king in order to do that. That was the basic standard principle. Well, that was the way not to die in Babylon, right? Babylon? Was it Babylon? I may be messing up. Anyway, in exile. That was the way not to die. I'm in Persia. I'm sorry. Yeah, I get the chronology. Sometimes I get mixed up. They're all in exile. I mean, they were in exile through multiple kingdoms. So sometimes you can forgive me, perhaps, maybe off the cuff here. So I think that they had to revert because they weren't able to embrace the blessings of the land because they weren't on their inheritance and they couldn't go to Jerusalem. They couldn't go to the tabernacle. They couldn't celebrate. They couldn't do all that. And so I think they did. I think Daniel reverted to that. We're going to do the best we can. We're going to try to not get sick and die because even the royal cuisine was prepared according to abhorrent health standards. By modern standards. It was horrible. So I think Daniel was trying not to die. He wasn't trying to follow the law because there's nothing in the law that says you have to be a vegan, right? Steak sauce on celery, it just doesn't fly, Right or wrong? You ever put steak sauce on celery? No? No. Just don't do it. Just eat the celery. Don't pretend it's a steak. All the near meat and stuff, like you can go to Burger King and buy some fake burger or something. That ain't kingly burgers, boy. All right, so we're over. So if you have any other questions or comments, you can send those to me or ask me afterwards or whatever. But we're done. Father, thank you for this day. We do thank you for your word, and we thank you that there are so many answers to questions about really common misconceptions about your character, about the function of the law and the nature of the law in and among Israel, in the land, and what it did and what it didn't do, and how beautiful it is, and how freeing it is. Father, we thank you for that, and the example that it is, and the truth that it contains. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.